swamps, we deal with mountains, so it takes a long time.
We have sections of road where you're driving for 10 miles at a time where you're not going to see a single house.
Bringing broadband to Vermont is a matter of letting residents of rural areas participate in this century's economy.
Connected tells the story of how Vermonters banded together to bring the internet to rural areas in the state. It is both an inspirational and an indicator of how quickly people and places can be left behind by the speed of technology. Good afternoon and welcome to Across the Fence. I'm Jolie Whitney. The internet brings the world to your fingertips, but for many in Vermont, just getting connected feels a world away. As of last year, over 1,700 locations in the state weren't served by even the slowest service provided. That's according to state data. As everyday tasks like paying bills, entertainment, and even shopping at your local grocery store move online, the digital divide threatens to leave people in our region out of the loop. Connected, Vermont's grassroots effort for rural broadband, created by Well Told Films in collaboration with Vermont Community Broadband, tells the story of how a groundswell by Vermonters for Vermonters to bring rural communities into the digital age. Joining me today in the studio are Christine Hallquist from Vermont Community Broadband and award-winning director and editor of Well Told Films, Chad Ervin. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you.
Christine, let's start with you and kind of define our terms here. What is broadband?
Well, when I talk about broadband, I like to equate it to electricity. And I will say that that broadband is even more important than electricity today, but we have this older technology that still hangs around. You know, when you plug in and you have your lights on, you expect them to be on all the time. You don't expect them to be dimming and going out. So we say that if it's not fiber optic, it's not broadband, because fiber optic is the most reliable connection you can get. So Vermont, through the legislature, has committed to getting fiber optic broadband to available to every address in the state.
And we saw in that trailer, people are up on telephone poles, so that's something that you roll out manually, is that right?
Yes, it's very much like the electric system. You put them on poles, you run this steel cable, and then you wrap the fiber around the steel cable.
And what is a CUD when it comes to broadband?
A CUD it's very unique to Vermont. It's called a Communication Union District. In 2015, the Vermont legislature came to the realization that the private providers would never really get to these rural areas in Vermont because it's just not profitable. So by putting together 2 towns or more, you could form what's called a municipal district. And really it gets to what I love about Vermont. It gets to people pulling together to make the impossible happen.
Absolutely, and Chad, in the trailers and in the documentary itself, this is compared to the highway system and electrification, which are huge things that we can take for granted nowadays. Do you think that comparison's apt? What has changed since those were kind of instituted nationally?
Well, I think that in terms of the scale of the effort to roll this out, it's comparable to those things. I think that we heard from a lot of people the comparison to the rural electrification process. In some ways, because there was also community efforts through the electric co-ops to provide electricity and with the intent to make sure that all addresses were served, even the more remote and rural areas and farms led the way in a lot of ways.
And Christine, do you agree that this rollout is historical in that sense?
Yes, in fact, as I was the former CEO of Vermont Electric Cooperative, it was very much like this. I had a picture in my office of the first pole that was set, the electric utility pole, and I thought, wouldn't it be nice to be living during those days when everybody banded together? So this is exactly what's happening. We have 400 plus volunteers across the state on boards making this happen. So it feels identical to what I read about with envy. And by the way, George Aiken, who was Vermont's governor and then senator, was the leader in the rural electric cooperative movement. So again, Vermont taking leadership with broadband is historically apt.
And we talked about a couple different consequences of not having internet, whether it's online shopping or paying bills or anything like that. For both of you, was there anything during this documentary that stood out as maybe an unexpected consequence of not having reliable internet access?
I think that I don't know if I would put it that way, but I would say that a lot of times the first thing you think about is high-tech industries and people playing video games. And the things that we heard about the most, though, were if you were locked in place with a disability and unable to travel as much, or if you were in an elder care facility, which we traveled and talked to them, the need is extremely high there in the areas of telehealth, and also the usefulness for broadband on farms is actually one of the people we interviewed. He's able to remotely monitor his calving barn and help talk people through the process there. And so it's things that you don't think about at first blush, but is very useful, and in fact even more consequential a lot of times for these people than just the high-tech areas.
Absolutely. Did you notice anything similar?
Well, yeah, I would say what really pops out for me is that you've got people in rural areas who are isolated, and they're with everything moving to broadband and the internet, they're even doubly isolated. So living in a rural area becomes very important. I would say that social interaction becomes probably one of the most important things.
And Christine, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but this grassroots movement to kind of get Vermont connected is described as a uniquely Vermont initiative, essentially. But other states are having these broadband rollout problems as well. What made this so uniquely Vermont?
Well, this is uniquely Vermont. I'll even talk about my own relationship with Vermont. Vermont, we don't have the same political divide that we see in the rest of the nation. If you look at these other states, there's huge political divides. And I'll point out that the governor asked me to be on his administration in 2016, and I declined. Then I was his opponent in 2018 as the Democratic candidate for governor, and then he called me and asked me to do this position. So that's an example of how Vermont works. We work together in spite of any of our policy differences. And I think that just emanates through the whole state of Vermont. If you go to our legislature, we're all accessible in the legislature. So it's one of those wonderful things about Vermont.
And what could other states maybe learn from Vermont's, that collaboration and the broadband rollout specifically?
Well, I think we put your divisions aside and focus on the important things for your residents.
And we're talking about this rollout process, but a lot of the time it's not just a matter of getting the broadband put out there, but also working with telecom companies. Can you talk about that kind of relationship when it comes to access?
Sure. In my testimony to the legislature prior to Act 71, I talked about the fact there are many people that were angry with the private telecom providers. They didn't come to the rural areas. But of course, coming to these rural areas would mean they would lose money and eventually go out of business. So having a sustainable business case is critical. And we don't have the money to bring community networks to every address in the state. So it was very important to have a public-private partnership. The estimates I gave the legislature would be over $1.2 billion to do this on our own. But if we do it with public-private partnerships, it would cost $550 million.
And Chad, we're talking a lot about the difficulties of not having broadband access. And of course, in order to make this film, you had to go out to places where that's not readily available. So what was it like having to go to places that maybe didn't have GPS access or other things when it came to the production of this?
Well, you don't have to travel very far in Vermont to seem like you're in a really remote location. A lot of the places where it seemed like we were in the middle of nowhere was probably 20 minutes outside of Montpelier. So we to be able to travel around and interview as many people as possible in the state, we worked with a really small crew. My wife, Kristen Cantu, is a producer of the film, and she was also our driver as I was filming out the window, and most of the interviews we did with just the crew of the two of us, so that we could talk to as many people as possible and enable us to tell this story as a chorus of voices, just like the effort to bring broadband was also a community effort. We wanted to have the story told by a community of people in the documentary. Excuse me.
So it sounds like you were working with a very small crew, but you mentioned all those community partners. Can you talk about all the people who came together to make this happen?
To be able to list them, you mean in the to create the broadband?
Broadband, or I mean, in fact, just making the documentary. What inspired you to put this project together?
Well, we originally heard about the project. My background is in current affairs and journalism sort of stuff, and I did a whole lot of like war and crisis films. So anytime I hear about a project that sheds a positive, tells a positive story, especially things that are close to home, I'm always really excited to be a part of that. So when we first heard about this, I was very interested, and I
Absolutely, a story that impacts you close to home. Absolutely.
Yes.
And Christine, you talk about how the digital divide is becoming the economic divide. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yes, if you look at people who are not connected today in Vermont, there's a much higher percentage of low-income families living in these rural areas that are not connected. And add that to this energy burden, the fact that they have to drive so far to get everywhere. It's become a real burden to live in rural Vermont without being connected, because all of your work now is done on the internet. If you think about yourself and myself, I think about all of my financial transactions are done in the internet. So if we didn't correct this, the number of low-income families would increase. By connecting, we now can create the opportunity for business growth in these rural areas.
All right, thank you both for joining me. Sorry, before we wrap up, can you tell us, this is available on YouTube, but there are also a couple screenings coming up in our area. Can you tell me when people can look forward to those?
Oh, absolutely, yes. It'll be, Connected will be playing on the opening night of the Made Film Festival in Burlington on April 10th. And then there's a community screening in Vergennes on the April 12th. And so it's a great opportunity to get out and view and have a discussion with your community members.
Great, and if you can't make it to either of those, you can also watch Connected on YouTube. Visit the link on your screen to watch it right after I tell you that wraps up our program for today. From the crew behind the scenes here at WCAX, I'm Julie Whitney. Thank you for watching and have a good one.